Hi everyone, so today our passion project is about scandals and corruption within the financial industry. Like I said earlier, a lot of times we study rational and irrational human behavior in economics and economic theory, but today we're going to study people deliberately finding loopholes or just committing illegal acts within the financial industry. Okay, so before we get to the illegal things, let's talk about the legal side. So what the government basically uses as its main tool against corruption and scandals would be the SEC. A couple weeks ago, Street Fins had a guest speaker from the SEC come talk to us. And basically he explained that the SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission that has two main jobs. One, regulate markets, two, protect investors. So a little history, first of all. The SEC was formed as part of FDR's New Deal right after the stock market crash in 1929, which is part of the Great Depression. And basically, it's a commission that is made of 5 people, like 5 heads that are appointed by the president, and then a bunch of other people like beneath them. And so these 5 people are usually 3 from one party and 2 from another party. So in this case, it'd be 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans because the president is a Democrat. Before it was the opposite. And these 5 people are usually working together to basically do those functions. And they would do things like, for example, protect against fraud. They would try to prevent insider trading. They would try to basically work out mergers and acquisitions so that it's like, a fair way to do it. And they would also oversee a lot of deals and make sure that they're fair. And they're independent to a certain extent because they're a commission, which means they're part of the executive branch, which is one of the 3 branches of government. As a commission, they are tied to the president, but they're a little bit further removed from the president than, say, a lot of other agencies, like, for example, the Agriculture Department. And so in this case, the Securities and Exchange Commission is appointed by the president, like those people, but they make a lot of decisions that aren't necessarily approved by the president, which is a good thing. I'd say they're further removed from politics. And besides that, they also work with the Justice Department.
All right, so now we're going to be talking about Jordan Belfort, aka the Wolf on Wall Street. If we go to the next slide, please. So in the 1987 movie Wall Street, Michael Douglas as Gordon Gekko gave an insightful speech where he said, "Greed, for lack of a better word, is good." He wanted to make the point that greed is a clean drive that captures the essence of an evolutionary spirit. But few figures in the finance world can claim as much influence as Jordan Belfort over the reputation of Wall Street as a greedy, heartless place. In 1999, Belfort pleaded guilty to numerous crimes related to the stock market manipulation and the running of a long-term scam involving penny stocks. For some of you who already know, for those of you who don't know what a penny stock is, it refers to a small company's stock that typically trades for less than $5 a share. So while there can be sizable gains in trading penny stocks, there can also be equal risks of losing a significant amount of an investment in a short period. In the wake of his sentencing and time in prison, Belfort wrote 2 memoirs. The first, The Wolf of Wall Street, which was popularized in 2013 movie adaptation starring actor Leonardo DiCaprio. In 2017, he released another memoir, a self-help book entitled The Way of the Wolf. So Belfort has drawn criticism for profiting off his story of stealing money from innocent people, while his victims actually received nothing, or even less than that. So after its scandals and a stint in prison for securities fraud, Belfort has reinvented himself as a motivational speaker, unfortunately. And one of his primary topics is the distinction between greed, ambition, and passion on Wall Street. Okay, before we watch this video, I just want to go a little bit into detail about what exactly happened. So if we can go to the next slide, please.
To me, they have very.
So from the outside, Stratton Oakmont may have looked like a legitimate stock brokerage firm, but in reality, it was a bona fide boiler room. Stratton Oakmont is the imaginary firm that Jordan Belfort actually formed with his coworkers. A boiler room is a term used to describe an outbound call center that sells questionable stocks and investments, often over the telephone or through email. Stratton Oakmont practiced dishonest tactics in order to push underperforming stocks, typically penny stocks, like I mentioned before, onto unsuspecting victims. The company's employees often spouted false and misleading claims to investors to sell more stocks and drive up the price of shares. All the while, Stratton Oakmont already owned shares in the company while they were trading. So when their schemes actually led to a higher share price, they would then sell their holdings, all of their securities, and walk away with a hefty profit. This tactic is known as a pump and dump, which is a form of fraud. If that sounds familiar, it's almost like Wall Street bets in modern times. So Jordan Belfort's stock manipulation strategy eventually caught up with him in 1996. So Stratton Oakmont was forcibly closed, fortunately. Jordan Belfort was banned from the brokerage industry, jailed, and required to pay back $110 million to the investors his company had deceived. Now, although Stratton Oakmont no longer exists, they are surely not the first nor the last company to run a boiler room operation. Um, According to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission's Scamwash, that's a really long name, in the first 6 months of 2018, Australians lost over $26 million due to investment fraud. So not only is this happening in America, but this is happening as well in other countries. So how can you protect yourself? Here are a few red flags of a pump and dump scam. So one person or one set of people are suddenly hyping up a stock at Wall Street Bets. The security in question has historically had a low trading volume. That's a huge red flag. You always want to look at the volume. And if you aren't able to verify claims and you aren't receiving a high pressure pitch from someone. Cassie, if we can go back one more slide so we can watch the 60 minutes video. Yeah.
To me, they have very little credibility right now. I've been trying to settle this thing for years, and they've essentially.
Is the volume all right? Perfect. Okay.
To me, they have very little credibility right now. I've been trying to settle this thing for years, and they've essentially stonewalled me at every step. So I've said enough about this. Let's move on.
Let me ask you this
No,
one
let's
thing.
move on, okay? Honestly, I'm ready. I'm not going to get attacked here. You're here, so I'm done with this. Next.
I'm not attacking you.
No, but honestly,
I'm just.
you're a very nice woman, but you're starting to like get to the point. It's obviously just a hatchet job here. So I'm kind of like, pretty much ready to move on.
There's nothing hatchet about it.
Well, to me, there is.
Well, the last thing is that apparently you have an oral contract with your management, the Fordham Company. Is that an attempt to hide your income?
Next question.
I think the peanut gallery is going to start chiming really quickly. We've been audited.
I think you can air what you want here out of this interview. It's done. Oh my God, you got a lot of nerve, boy. I'll tell you. Honestly, really, honestly.
Why
really,
can't I ask
just
these
honestly,
questions?
and I was told this is a friendly, nice interview, and that's no one has ever treated me as disrespectfully as you have. Really, okay?
All right. Okay.
Let's give it a whirl.
Eventually, a still displeased but more composed Jordan Belfort returned to finish the interview. What is your one greatest regret?
My greatest regrets for sure is losing people money. Absolutely. If I could have done, if people say, would you change anything? I said, I just wouldn't lose people money.
What would you say to the victims?
Wow. Well, first, of course, I'm sorry for what happened, and that not a day goes by in my own life where, I in some way don't pay for it. And if you look at other people in my position, I'm the only one who over the long term has been paying back investors. So, and I'm proud of that. And, my goal one day would be to pay back all the money. Can I? I hope so. No guarantees.
So yeah,
no
that is The
guarantees.
Wolf on Wall Street.
Yeah.
Not as charming as the movie.
All right, let's move on.
To me.
Okay, so the second scandal, oh, by the way, these are chronological, so we're going from the oldest to the newest. And the second scandal we're going to cover is the Enron scandal. This for me is one of my favorites because it's not that well known in our generation because it's a little bit before our time, but I still find it really fan fave. Thank you, Gordon. It's still very interesting because of how much they're able to get away with for so long. Okay, so first off, we're going to start off with a little diagram. I'll just give you guys like 10 seconds or so before I start talking about it. So basically, you guys can see here that the bar graph, the light blue, shows that the Enron revenue, annual revenue, was way higher than other similarly sized companies. And so by that, these are basically tens of thousands of employees. So Microsoft almost doubled Enron's employees. And we know Microsoft is a pretty successful company. So you might be wondering, how did Enron make that much money? Is anyone brave enough to guess, if you don't already know, how they conned the financial world, or what scandal exactly did they commit? You guys can type it in the chat or unmute. It's actually a lot simpler than you might think. Okay, in that case, I will call on someone. Oh, yes, Yash. Very close. Basically reported fake profits. Fake it till you make it. Yes, thank you, Dion. And so Enron basically did a lot of finagling with their accounting to basically get away with this much. And because in the stock market, everything's up to perception, then if you perceive them to make a lot of money, then their shares actually balloon, right? They make a lot of money. And this can't go on forever, which is why eventually Enron did crumble down. But let's talk about the rise first. Okay. So you guys can see there are basically 4 periods where they rose to be one of the most successful companies of their time. And so there's 2 important things before we look at the timeline. 2 things coincided with Enron's rise. One was the government's decision to deregulate energy markets, meaning that Enron could get away with a lot more because they were an energy company. As you can see in the red, Enron was formed between a merger between 2 companies, and they were basically an energy supplier. And the second thing is the dot-com bubble, right? Remember, like around the 1990s to the 2000s was when the dot-com bubble occurred. And basically it was like a huge ballooning of the stock prices of all of these different companies that were part of the dot-com bubble. And because all of their share prices just like inflated, people thought that it was normal that Enron was doing so as well. So they didn't think anything out of the ordinary. Fortune names Enron the most innovative company for the next 6 years. And after this guy becomes a CFO, he helps with the accounting to basically hide their financial losses. And 2000 is when they hit the all-time high of $90.56. Okay, so let's talk about their rise in more detail. So it's basically divided up into 3 periods. From 1985 to 1995, Enron rebrands itself as a main energy supplier. And they basically do most of their accounting like scandal is around one strategy called mark-to-marketing. And let's be clear, first of all, mark-to-marketing is a very valid and legitimate form of accounting that a lot of people or a lot of different companies use. Enron basically just used it in an illegal way, or like they found a loophole. And what they did was they basically looked at projected profits and then reported them as actual profits that had already been made. And you see the problem with this is that sometimes they'll fall short. And then basically they're duping their shareholders who believe that their profits are this high when maybe in reality in the future it's only this high. And basically it's estimated profits replacing actual profits. And the second thing was from 1995 to 1998 when Enron created a subsidiary, Enron Online, EOL, which is basically a trading site that focused on commodities. And they were always either the buyer or the seller of the transaction. This one isn't really illegal. This is just something that helped them achieve more success. And then the third thing is from 1998 to 2000. So right before their all-time high of their share price was when they basically formed a partnership with the company Blockbuster. And Blockbuster was a company that basically did this thing called like VOD, which I actually forgot what it's called or what it stands for, but it's basically this like video production sort of thing. And what they did was they used mark-to-marketing while Blockbuster, I'm not sure if they were aware of it, but I think they kind of just overlooked it. Okay, so Enron did really, really well for like that maybe 15 so years. They were just climbing the market, but eventually they had to fall because this just wasn't a sustainable way. Scandals often aren't sustainable, as you'll see. Okay, so in 2000, right after they hit their all-time high, they started having some fractures. And how it began is that the energy market itself was very volatile, and Enron is basically mostly just an energy company, and so they suffered a lot because of that. And so when they suffered a lot, they tried to hide their financial losses, right? That CFO, that's what he was basically in charge of doing. And the way they did this was with mark-to-marketing, but mostly with the SPVs, and that also helped them hide their debt. SPVs are basically special purpose vehicles or entities that help them hide their debt in a special way. Okay, so let's talk about mark-to-marketing first. Mark-to-marketing, when they project when they have expected profits, and they write them down as actual profits. So they would build an asset like a power plant, and then they would say that, oh, we've already made this many like millions or billions of dollars from that power plant, when in reality they haven't made a cent on it yet. They just say that they will, but they say like they already have, even though it's something that they might do. And so sometimes they fall short of their expected profits. And what they do is basically they transfer the asset to an off the books corporation, like another subsidiary. And so the loss goes unreported. This is something that a lot of companies actually do, but it's not a good thing. And then eventually what it did with the SPVs to hide large amounts of loss and large amounts of debt was they basically transferred some of their stock to the SPV. And then in exchange, they took cash. So the SPV is basically like a subsidiary or like a separate entity that belongs or like that stems out of Enron and basically partners with Enron. So sometimes you'll see companies like create its own like subsidiary or branch and then make like deals with it or transfer assets to it so that it will go unreported if it loses some money. And so what would happen is the SPV would exchange money for some of the stock. But the problem is this is like really vulnerable because when the energy market started collapsing, the SPV is tied to Enron. So when Enron fails, its insurance, the SPV, also fails. And so the SPVs were originally intended to basically insure them or to hedge their risk, which means to like, lessen their risk. But it didn't do so because once Enron failed, so did the SPVs. So I'm not really sure what the plan there was. And after that, they basically got some help from their accounting firm, or not their accounting firm, but a firm that they were partnering with called Arthur Andersen. And this was like a really, really big, famous accounting firm at the time that later got in a lot of trouble for helping out Enron and overlooking their illegal activity. And so Enron basically just got Arthur Andersen to sign off and approve a bunch of their illegal actions. And yeah, that's what happened. Okay, so then from 2001, the public basically already knew Enron was doing a bunch of these really sketchy things. And so they started getting investigated by the SEC. It's important to know, though, the SEC, with a lot of bureaucratic agencies, moves at like a snail's pace. So they didn't start investigating until Enron closed an SPV, which was like kind of a red flag. And it was the first time Enron reported a quarterly loss. And so what happened with that is they basically reported a loss, but knew that this is like a red flag and the public was kind of like getting nervous. So they made sure to change their pension plan. So the pension plan is something for the employees that basically includes a bunch of benefits for them, right? And so they said the employees weren't allowed to sell their shares for 30 days, which basically tries to stabilize the stock, even though people were already like, selling the stock in mass. And then what happened was Dynegy was a different corporation that was originally going to merge with Enron, and then they pulled out of the deal because they're like, Enron's being very unstable, unreliable right now. And then in December, Enron finally files for bankruptcy, and the Enron converts into the Enron Creditors Recovery Corporation, which is basically like Enron, a shadow of their former corporation, because now their only purpose is to deorganize everything and basically liquidate all of their assets and try to pay off their employees, even though most of the employees lost a lot of money. Okay, and finally, with regulation, so what we see is the Arthur Andersen, the firm, basically avoided conviction. So it says a lot about the American justice system, but they avoided conviction and they only lost a lot of basically public face. And so what they did was they gathered themselves back up and are now known as Andersen Global. So if you guys have heard of that, it's like a whole nother firm. It's less successful or less big than Arthur Andersen, but it's basically trying to climb its way back into the ranks. And so that's what Arthur Andersen converted into. And then after that, a bunch of the Enron executives in the next couple years got arrested and convicted. They got off with like just a couple fines and some prison time. Most of them got off like really early. And then finally, there was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is pretty important. I think it's the most good that came out of this scandal. So what happened was the government basically heightened the consequences for destroying or lying on any kind of accounting or balance sheets and defrauding shareholders. And so this is like trying to be a preventive measure for future scandals. So in total, the shareholders lost $74 billion and employees lost billions in pension benefits.
All right, so the Lehman Brothers. Wait, next slide, next slide. Yeah, so it was founded by 3 German immigrants who obviously are brothers in 1850 as a dry goods store, which was basically like a small store that sold textile and clothing. And then it found its way into trading cotton because cotton at the time was very, very valuable. So the store became a firm that engaged in commodity trading very early on. And by 1906, Lehman Brothers shifted their business again into underwriting shares, which was the process of helping company become public. And so under the leadership of several executives, it became the nation's 4th largest investment bank. Okay, next slide. Oh, wait, next slide. Yeah, so, but how exactly did they become bankrupt? So it all started in 1997. So the firm became one of Wall Street's one of the first Wall Street firms to move into the business of mortgage lending. And during the process, they bought several already established lending firms just to quickly expand their mortgage business, which was hugely profitable, even though the business bore great risks in the future. Wait, next slide. Yeah, next slide. Oh, okay. Yeah, but the problem was that the lending was slightly different because they were lending money to people who had no ability to pay it off in the future. And this essentially caused the housing market to inflate with money made out of thin air. And next slide. Well, but all these things before 2008 were all in their favor. So by 2003, they made 18.2 billion in loans. 2004, it was 40 billion. And by 2006, they were lending 50 billion per month. And eventually by 2008, they reached an asset of 680 billion, but they only had 22.5 billion of real capital. And on the left, it was the image of the housing price index of the United States. And you can see it was surging. Yeah, so next slide. Wait, next slide. Yeah, so, and eventually the Lehman Brothers made their commercial real estate holding like 30 times greater than their real capital. And in such a highly leveraged structure, a 3 to 5% decline, the real estate value would wipe out all of their capital, which would instantly make them bankrupt. And yeah, could you turn to the next slide? Yeah, so the beginning of their collapse starts with their high leverage, making them extremely valuable to the deteriorating housing market conditions around 2007. And so in the second fiscal quarter, they reported a loss of 2.8 billion because the housing price was declining. And it was forced to sell 6 billion in assets in the first half of 2008 alone. And its stock tumbled down 73%. And by September 15, they filed for bankruptcy and marked the end of the firm's 150 years of history. Yeah, the end.
Okay, so now we'll talk about pyramid schemes, another type of scheme. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. So first I wanted to ask all of you, let's go. So by definition, a Ponzi scheme is a form of fraud that lures investors and pays profit to earlier investors with funds from more recent investors. The schemes lead victims to believe that profits are coming from legitimate business activity, and they remain unaware that other investors are the source of funds. So this is the Wikipedia definition. Let me simplify it for you. This scheme attracts many investors to fund a fake project. So I might say, hey, I'm building a mall, and you won't know where the mall is because it's non-existent, right? And you will give me money because you're investing and you're gullible, so you'll give me money, right? But the investors, and this provides results for a certain time period. So the earlier investors get paid with the fund from the more recent investors. So as you can see, this pyramid explains it better than words, right? There's this main guy, and then he has 2 other guys, and then he has 4 other guys, and then he has 8 other guys. So everyone makes profits, or actually only the top guy makes profits because everyone just gives the money to the top. Now, you can go to the next slide, Cassie. So this is the pyramid scheme, and I actually rearranged the slides after Cassie went into present mode. So the Ponzi scheme is a type of pyramid scheme where there's one guy at the top, and then he has people working for him, right? So I wanted to ask you guys, have any of you watched Breaking Bad? And if you have, you can put yes in the chat. If you haven't, it's fine. So you can do that. Okay, so 2 people have watched Breaking Bad, and 1 person's dad loves that show. Okay, so the main character, Heisenberg, he runs a drug project where he has his partner, right? So you can imagine instead of 1 guy at the top, there are 2 people at the top, right? And then they hire the 3 other drug dealers, right? Some guy named Skinny Pete, and then some fat guy, and then some innocent guy, right? So they hire those 3. And this Heisenberg, his main idea is that you need to recruit people who will recruit more people who will recruit people and more people, right? So they take over Albuquerque with their drug operation. So technically that's a pyramid scheme, right? And Matthew said earlier that the Wolf on Wall Street, his scheme had losses of about 200 million. Cassie, can you go to the next slide, please? Well, here you can see Madoff. His scheme cost 5,000 investors a total of $50 billion. Yes, with a B. So that's 2,500 times the amount of what the Wolf on Wall Street guy had in his scheme. So Madoff is the most recent, or Madoff orchestrated one of the biggest schemes of the 21st century, and possibly the only big scheme to actually care about. And it was in 2008. So that was during the housing crisis and all that. So just to put it in perspective, we have $200 million, and then you have $50 billion, right? And what he did was he had his own investment company, right? And he said that, hey, I have this investment company and you guys can invest. And when he got caught, it was revealed that it was basically a Ponzi scheme. So he cost 5,000 clients that much money. Now, this is the fun part. Let's teach you how to create your own pyramid scheme. Okay, so the prerequisites are that you have a low-cost membership plan and you have a social media following. Where I want to get at is, okay, so you need to have those 2. Now you have to offer your followers a membership plan. What do I mean by that? If you've seen YouTubers, they have that join button beside the subscribe button that you can click, and you can pay $6, $7, $10 a month, and you can get special perks, right? And also some YouTubers have Patreons where you can also like, they have exclusive content, right? But is it really worth it? I don't think so. Now you tell your followers to convince your friends. Now you tell your followers to convince their friends to also purchase this membership. Now, you as that main guy will have promised money to these people for selling your business. So basically they're resellers. And then it just keeps on repeating, right? So you tell them, they tell their friends, they tell their friends, and soon you have a big pyramid. Now, the point is that you can go to the next slide, Cassie. That it won't work. In many countries, pyramid schemes are illegal, especially in America. And there was one in Canada where one person offered a low-cost membership plan, like I said earlier, and he charged like $3,200 per membership, right? And then that just kept on repeating and repeating and repeating and grew. But now we need to know how do these pyramid schemes collapse, right? And if you think of a pyramid, right, it's a triangle. The base is bigger than the top, right? You don't have 50 main guys and only one at the base. You have to have a strong base, right? So if the amount of new people that come to your service decrease, then you're going to lose, then your pyramid scheme will collapse, right? And that's how Madoff, and that's how all these other schemes have also collapsed, right? There is, for a business, it's technically a business, right? You have to make money. And how do you make money? Through constant or through repeated sources of income, right? So if that decreases, you're going to lose money, even though you're just making less money, and you're going to go bankrupt, right? So it won't work. And I forgot, okay, so you can book yourself a ticket to a country which has a weak economy, and you can go crash their economy with your Ponzi scheme if you ever wanted to try it out. But it's illegal, and it also won't work. So go try it out at your own risk. That's it for, yeah, it's not a recommendation. It won't work. That and you'll just suffer jail time.
Thank
So
you for that,
that's
Gayan. All right, now let's talk smoothies. If we go to the next slide. So Herbalife is a multi-level marketing company whose products include dietary supplements. They entered a 3-year deferred prosecution agreement in which it admitted to conspiring to violate the books and records provision of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is an anti-bribery law. So what exactly happened? So through a group of subsidiaries, they needed certain licenses to sell its products in China through independent sales representatives. The company had engaged in a scheme to bribe Chinese officials in order to obtain the direct selling licenses for federal prosecutors. During that time, Herbalife obtained licenses at around 28 provinces, all while falsifying records to make the bribes appear as legitimate business expenses. They wrote it under travel and entertainment expenses. So there's a lot of commonality between these corrupt businesses, modifying their balance sheets and such. But like all corrupt businesses, they were eventually caught, and the company had to repay a $55.74 million criminal fine, plus $67.31 million in returning the money stolen and interest to resolve a related SEC civil case. Herbalife Nutrition will pay in total around $123 million to settle a criminal and civil charges it bribed Chinese officials and government agencies and media outlets to boost its businesses in China. So Herbalife has agreed to pay $123 million in penalties in total, which is a lot of money. This is where all that money goes from their overpriced smoothies and predatory business practices. If Herbalife meets conditions within that time period, then their charges will be dropped, but this penalty in total has been very detrimental to the company overall.
Yep, and if you guys are interested, there are accusations about Herbalife committing a pyramid scheme, but I don't believe they were actually convicted. But I'm sending a link in the chat right now if you guys want to hear about that.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Volkswagen emissions scandal, which has been named Dieselgate. Next slide, please. So Dieselgate is the company the automotive company Volkswagen's attempts to cheat emissions tests after environmental restrictions were tightened. There's this agency called the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and they announced that they would be altering the standard for engine emissions in the US, and they started having regulatory tests for a lot of different companies. They started I don't know how to explain that. They made regulatory emissions tests standard and often to make sure that companies weren't violating the standards that the EPA had announced that they would be changing. So Volkswagen was passing all their regulatory tests that the EPA was giving to them, but there was no actual evidence that Volkswagen had changed anything in their manufacturing process to alter their engines to coexist with the new emission standards. And this was because Volkswagen were fitting their cars with defeat devices, which are a software code that made the car able to distinguish between a lab test and real world driving. And so the cars were able to adjust their emissions outputs depending on if they were in a lab test, which is where all the emissions tests were given, or if they were out in the real world. So as a result of these defeat devices and not being discovered for a long time, Volkswagen vehicles went on for many years to produce 40 times the legal amount of nitrogen oxide than was the standard. And they violated the Clean Air Act by selling 590,000 vehicles in the US that violated the new law. They were found out by a study from a couple of college students and their professors who were testing a bunch of different cars just to see what the emissions were, and they were studying that, and they realized that the nitrogen oxide emissions that were coming from Volkswagen's cars were abnormally high. So when they wrote their report on their study and it was published, a lot of people found out about it. And the government was really mad when they found out about it, because every person back then, I don't know if this is still a thing, but every person back then who purchased a clean engine car got a $1,300 federal tax credit. And Volkswagen was marketing their cars as clean engine cars, even though they had the defeat devices. So Volkswagen was selling cars that weren't clean, but their consumers were getting all the benefits of people who did purchase clean engine cars. So Volkswagen said that they would fix all of their affected vehicles in 2015. And then after that, there was just a whole lot of money that Volkswagen lost. So on January 4th, 2016, the federal government filed a $46 billion civil lawsuit against Volkswagen for the company disregarding anti-pollution laws. On October 25th, 2016, I think I put in some of these dates wrong, Volkswagen paid $4.7 billion to the government, and they had to use $10 billion more to buy back and repair all the affected cars that they sold from 2009 to 2015, which was 475,000 cars. On December 20th, 2016, they had to pay $225 million to fund pollution prevention, like classes and acts in the United States. On January 11th, 2017, the SEC charged Volkswagen they charged Volkswagen with for the defraud of American investors because of the emission scandal, and they were fined $4.3 billion. And then on April 1st, 2017, a class action lawsuit. Well, up until this point, up until April 1st, 2017, Volkswagen were still allowed to sell their cars that were emitting way more than that was the standard in Canada. But on April 1st, 2017, Canada approved a class action lawsuit that allowed about 105,000 consumers to sue Volkswagen for selling them the cars that weren't to the standards, and this cost Volkswagen 1.8 billion. Next slide, please. In the first few months of the scandal, the company lost 46% of its value, and its stock dropped drastically. As we see, it was kind of spiking up and down, but it was generally there was a good line of best fit right in the middle. But then a little bit past 2015, the stock has took a giant plunge, and that's when they started getting found out for all of what they were doing, and they started losing a lot of money and having to pay out a lot of money. And today, Volkswagen stock is still 35% below the price it was before the Dieselgate scandal. And then now I'm passing it off to the next person.
Yeah, so I'll be covering FANG scandals. So the FANG companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, have a combined market cap of $5.9 trillion. And comparing this to the Dow Jones market cap, which is $8.3 trillion, it's clear that these companies are very dominant players in the stock market. And while these companies don't have any outright illegal activities, or probably don't have any outright illegal activities compared to the previous scandals, there are still some pretty serious issues involving them. And the question that we're going to try to answer over the next few slides is, how did these companies come to dominate the stock market, and why are some calling for more regulation? So starting with Facebook, do any of you know how Facebook rose to prominence and some of the reasons why it's the most successful social media company today? And you can just type it in the chat if you want. Yeah, so what Ratul said is correct. To some extent, they did make some very profitable acquisitions such as Instagram, and also did some growth-focused acquisitions such as WhatsApp. And also they employed a policy of controlled growth rather than rapid growth, which allowed them to retain users more than other social media companies such as MySpace or Friendster. And the main issue concerning Facebook is its sale of user data and the privacy concerns surrounding this practice. And this issue came to the forefront of national discourse with the Cambridge Analytica data breach that exposed the data of 87 million Facebook users. And obviously that's a lot of Facebook users, and those users were mainly in the United States. And the data that was exposed was political data, most of it. And in general, there have been privacy concerns over Facebook's tracking of user data and selling that user data to third parties. And this was just one of those instances that was exposed, but it's unknown how many other instances there might have been that weren't exposed. And this has also been the main cause behind calls for more regulation of Facebook to lessen its power over users and lessen the uh, practices that it does currently. And another reason for concern is the mental health impact of Facebook. And many users who use Facebook consistently report being addicted to Facebook and checking the website constantly for updates and for instant gratification. And additionally, Facebook increases feelings of envy, self-loathing, and depression, as users who use Facebook often see the highlights of their peers rather than the negative aspects of their lives. And this has been cited by senators and uh, government agencies when they're talking about employing more regulations with Facebook in order to curb the influence it has on day-to-day life. So moving on to Apple, do any of you know how Apple rose to prominence? and why it's one of the most successful software and hardware companies today? Yeah, so Gavin says innovations, and that's completely correct. Apple, uh, yeah, in quotes, Apple has very high quality of products, or at least at the start, it had very high quality of products, and this resulted in very high brand loyalty and trust for Apple's products. But over time, what's happening is that Apple is uh, not innovating as much as it used to before, and rather focusing on uh, maximizing the amount of revenue it can from its existing products. And Apple has also been criticized for its labor practices, um, especially in China. And Apple factories have even been described as sweatshops. And Apple has allegedly used Uyghur labor, which is the group that's currently being discriminated against in China. And Apple's also been criticized for its tax practices. Um, Famously, Apple pays almost no taxes in the US as it siphons off money to its subsidiaries in Ireland, Netherlands, and the Caribbean, which have very little corporate tax rates. Also, Apple has been criticized for its anti competitive practices, and this is generally in the form of blocking apps that compete with Apple services, such as Spotify, which competes with Apple Music. And all three of these have been cited by government agencies when talking about uh, antitrust lawsuits or regulation to curb Apple's power. So Amazon, this one's kind of obvious, but do any of you know how Amazon rose to prominence? Yeah, e-commerce was the main thing. And also one thing that Amazon employed was that it focused on building services. Yeah, it did start as a bookstore, as Adi says, but it focused on building services that helped internally. And many of these services, such as AWS, have been publicized, which has allowed Amazon to become kind of a giant with multiple different industries. But some of the main scandals surrounding Amazon are its treatment of workers and its anti competitive practices. Specifically, the company has been criticized for its warehouse conditions and employee treatment. And many warehouse employees have complained that Amazon's wages are too little for the amount of hours it demands and the level of work it demands. And this has resulted in strikes and also legislation in both the United States and the European Union that's forcing Amazon to pay its workers more. Amazon also faces criticism for its anti-competitive practices, and this includes removing competitor products on Amazon.com or partnering with Apple and other tech giants to squash competition, and also attempting to control prices so that it can boost its own revenue. And this has also contributed in antitrust lawsuits being filed against Amazon in both the US and the European Union. And Netflix is kind of an outlier because there's not as many scandals surrounding Netflix. But do any of you know how Netflix rose to prominence or some of the things that it did that allowed it to become successful? Yeah, so Gyan's TV subscription, and that's cheaper alternative. So what Netflix did was it prioritized subscriber needs and requests rather than focusing on its own revenue in its early years. And this allowed it to have immense brand loyalty, and that continues today with its user interface and ease of watching. And yeah, it used to be a DVD rental service before. So as I said before, Netflix is an outlier among the other companies because it's allegations surrounding it aren't really focused on anti-competitive behavior. They're mainly focused on content issues and employee poaching. So content issues are based on what Netflix shows. So this is like depiction of suicide, drug abuse, violence, smoking, etc. And some lawmakers have called for regulation of what Netflix is allowed to show in the country that it's showing it in. So in the European Union, they've blocked some of the shows and movies that Netflix provides because it doesn't comply with the laws there. Additionally, Netflix has been accused of poaching employees, and this is just influencing employees at other companies to break their contracts and join Netflix instead. But again, Netflix is an outlier because the scandals don't really relate to anti-competitive practices. And finally, Google. Do you guys know how Google rose to prominence and some of the things that it did that allowed it to diversify and become a giant? Yeah, so Ratul says PageRank. So in it, yeah, Google also got into the business early. So it employed, yeah, effective leadership of Sergey Brin and Larry Page. So what Google did was initially it focused on its search engine and its PageRank, but later on it diversified really well and successfully into other services such as YouTube, Google Maps, Android, Google Cloud, etc. But Google, because of its diversification, has faced a lot of antitrust lawsuits in both the European Union and the United States. And these mainly revolve around Google promoting its own services on Google search. Like if you searched up for videos or something like that, it would show YouTube first. Or if you searched up for maps, it would show Google Maps first, and so on. And also, Google has been accused of censoring like political voices on its services, such as YouTube and Google Search. So, for example, YouTube has taken down videos from specific political groups, and this has been another cause for this has been another reason behind people pushing for regulation of Google and its practices. But yeah.
Okay, thanks for coming, guys, and thanks for listening. That concludes the presentation portion of the meeting, and I'll just be giving a couple announcements now. Okay. So a couple